Okay.
Okay,
right.
Good evening, everybody. This is the Monday, November 22nd meeting of the Permanent Public Building Committee. We are still doing things virtual, and we'll follow the same approach we've done in all these meetings. Tonight, we have two main items, the school master plan with one voting item, and we also have the Ridge Hill demolition project, and we also have one voting item within that as well. Before we get started, we also have the other PVC other business. I do have one topic in that. But before we get rolling into the main items, we have approve the minutes from the previous meeting. All four of us were there prior, so I think we have sufficient coverage to do that. Do I hear a motion to approve the meeting minutes from the previous meeting?
I'll make that motion.
And do you have a second? Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, George. Okay. Any questions? Coming to the vote, which will be a roll call given the virtual meeting. Richard?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
Lynn?
Aye.
And the chair is aye. Okay. So with that, we'll go to the next item, which is the school master plan. And I believe you'll take that, Hank?
Yes, we should admit Doran Whittier. Catherine, can you do that, please?
Yeah, you got Jason and Michelle Rogers as well, and also Ann.
And what about Richard Lunetta? Let him in too? FinCom?
I see no reason why you shouldn't.
Why not? Yep.
Okay.
So we got everybody.
He's just a visitor, right?
Right, but I was going to promote him to panelist well, I don't know if he wants
to.
Fine.
That's fine. I mean, he may have questions.
Well, they're supporting this activity, right?
Right.
With funds that they approved.
Correct.
So Richard Lunetta is the representative of FinCom to see what progress we're making in that, I guess.
Yeah.
As I recall from their,
yep.
From their.
Why don't we get started while he comes in? So Hank, I'll turn it to you.
Yes, good evening, everyone. We have been working with an education working group on the refinements to the school master plan. And that has been occurring during the last couple months. There are two presentations that were made to that group that you'll be seeing this evening. The outline of what was requested by FinCom. I think everyone is aware in terms of the coordination of looking at the preferred scheme and several of other variations on that and the status quo scheme to come up with a financial plan as well as a school master plan that is achievable within the town's borrowing limits. Doran Whittier has made a general attempt to stretch the projects out, but ultimately Dave Davison will have to input the data into his model to confirm borrowing limits and those types of issues. So with that, I will turn it over to Doran Whittier, who have been
Thank you ever so
taking
much.
this to date.
Good. Let me give you some background.
Can you go on mute, Richard Lunetta? Or else, Catherine, you can mute him. No, thank you. All right, all set.
Great. Thank you, Hank. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having us back again. Don Walter with Doran Whittier. And with me tonight are Michelle Rogers and Jason Boone. What I want to do is just quickly refresh everyone's memory about what it is we're doing with this study extension, and talk about some of the goals, and then turn it over to Jason and Michelle to take you through the presentation. But as you know, the issues that we're charged with are looking at the facility and capacity issues at Mitchell Elementary School, the facility issues at Pollard, the capacity issues at High Rock, and then, as Hank mentioned, this idea of trying to craft these solutions in a way that help minimize the financial investment of the town in terms of over the short term or upfront, which will in fact then take the projects and extend them out over a period of time. So that's what we're basically looking at with the study. Of course, there's a lot of work going into getting to where we're going to be, but that's the general overview. And then in terms of tonight, what we're going to do is talk about the enrollment projections, which have been updated to include the October 1 numbers and how that affects the capacity scenarios for the different projects. And then we've looked at some preliminary design explorations for High Rock and its capacity issue, for Pollard in terms of its facility and how that may interact with a High Rock solution. And then Elliott, because we know there's so much growth in that part of town, and Mitchell. And then lastly, and that'll be through Jason, and then lastly, Michelle will take you through all the various timelines that we put together in scenarios. So with that being said, unless there are any questions, I'll turn it right over to Jason to get into the presentation.
Thanks, Don. As Don had mentioned, McKibben has continued to do their work on the district's enrollment projections. And what we have as an update on that is some new demographic information has started to become available, but isn't fully available yet. But McKibben has delivered to the district a preliminary report, and the trajectory of the enrollment has changed a little bit since we were in the district in 2019. And what we've done with that information is we've updated our capacity calculations for each of the buildings. That's the focus of this master plan extension. So we wanted to share the outcome of that analysis with you. So for each of the buildings that are in the focus of this study, we've produced these kinds of graphics. And so what you're seeing here, the various lines in the chart represent different projections that have happened over the last year plus or so. The one that's of the most interest to us right now is the purple line, which represents McKibben's most recent enrollment forecast, even though it's preliminary. The yellow area in all of these graphics represents the capacity of each building based on the district's current class size boundary. So the bottom line, for example, is based on the minimum class size guideline, and then the upper line is representative of the district's maximum class size guideline. So this first example is for a model that replaces Mitchell in kind as a 4-section school, and High Rock does not become a 6th elementary school. So what that results in is 120 classrooms across the entire elementary district. And what you're seeing in this graphic is that the purple line is completely within the capacity. And at the end of the enrollment trajectory, we are sort of on the higher end of the class size guidelines. Keep in mind that when we talk about minimum class size and maximum class size, really that range is only 4 students. So while the capacity bandwidth looks relatively wide, we're really talking about a difference of 4 students across those class size guidelines. So if we were to replace Mitchell in kind, right, the capacity does not change across the elementary district. Michelle, you want to move on to the next one there? Oh, too many. Back one. There you go. This second model.
Can I just interrupt for a minute?
Yes, of course, George.
I have trouble discerning the colors. I'm not quite colorblind, but I do have some different. Is the main line with the bubbles on them? That's the purple line.
Correct. The line that has the 2 circles on them, which represent the October 1 enrollment of this year, And the forecast at the end of that projection is the purple line. It's sort of sinusoidal in shape and relatively flat across the 15-year time horizon.
While we're here, can I ask one more question to clarify that? What was that line like before? In other words, have we seen a drop? We've seen a drop in enrollment. Is that what it says?
So in the
from
COVID,
the last time?
Correct. So we were last year in 2019. So between 2019 and 2020, the elementary enrollment across the district did experience a fairly significant drop. And that could be for many reasons, but what's believed is that many of them are COVID related. And so the other lines that you see here, the blue line, for example, was the best case scenario if the COVID circumstances had continued without any change. And obviously you can see there's quite a tremendous dip had that come to fruition. The other two lines represented if COVID returned, if the enrollment returned as if COVID never happened. And then the gray one, which is the highest, was if COVID had never happened and the developments occurred. And so finally, we've got this purple forecast, which is sort of in the middle of many of those. And as you can see, drops for just a little while and then ticks back up again, so that the starting endpoints of this particular forecast are about the same. Roughly 2,500 students across grades K through 5. This forecast is subject to be updated again once all of the 2020 census demographic data becomes available by municipality. And our suspicion is that that won't happen until next summer. So for purposes of the study, this is the best enrollment forecast that we're going to have to perform analyses against. Did you have any other questions, George?
I did have one more. I'm concerned about, we know what the enrollment is now in the elementary grades.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to change much at all between now and next June. So doesn't that mean that that purple line is just about there for the beginning of the 22-23 school year?
Correct. And so you can see that if you look just above the 22-23 label, the purple line is relatively flat.
Okay.
Right. So we're assuming that the students who are in kindergarten, for example, this year will matriculate to first grade, and a very high percentage of them will matriculate. That we won't have a lot of out migration in the first several years of this forecast.
Okay, I'm fine for now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good questions. So this model is as if we replaced Mitchell not with a 4-section school in kind, but with a 5-section school. And this is the target number of classrooms across the elementary district that we identified in our 2019 study, 6 more sections across the district. So in this case, because Mitchell was the focus of a building project, those 6 sections were placed on the Mitchell property. And you can see what happens to the capacity in the district. The little house represents when the Mitchell project would come online. And so rather than being sort of in the upper 2/3 of the district's capacity, now the enrollment forecast at the end of the trajectory is right in the middle of the district's class size guidelines. So by having the 6 extra classrooms, there's a little more wiggle room in the direction of the enrollment forecast over the 15 years that we're looking at.
So you're saying, if I may, just the 2,600 plus a few, Mitchell brings it up to about 2,750, 2,746.
So what, no. I think what we're saying, Stuart, is if we have 126 classrooms across the district, we could support a maximum of around 2,750 if we maxed out the class size guideline across the entire district.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But bringing Mitchell on at that point allows you to get to that.
Correct.
Right. That's all. That's I just wanted to play back from the graphic perspective.
Right. So in other words, adding the extra 6 classrooms to the elementary district adds bandwidth to the elementary district. in terms of capacity. Okay, Michelle. This is the forecast where Mitchell is a second project and it's a 3-section school, and High Rock comes on as the 6th elementary school. Right, in other words, 6th grade goes over to the Pollard campus, High Rock becomes an elementary school, and the project at Mitchell, instead of being a 4 or 5-section school, is a 3-section school, which we'll show in just a little bit is a much better fit for that particular piece of property. So what this graphic shows is the first house is the Pollard project coming to fruition and High Rock becoming available as an elementary school. So if you were to immediately relocate students from Mitchell to High Rock, you can see how the purple line goes outside the capacity width here. So for that duration between the conclusion of a Pollard project and the conclusion of a Mitchell project, you could reasonably fit all of the Mitchell students in the High Rock facility, but you would be right at or just over 1 or 2 students over your class size guidelines for the duration of the Mitchell project until it gets completed. But at the end of this second project, notice what happens to the yellow bandwidth at the very end. The district has much more capacity than they even had in the 126 classroom model, which may allow things like technology and world language and additional special education programming to occur in the elementary schools that currently isn't occurring because of space limitations.
Can you go back for a second? I'm missing the connection here. Why, if you move people to Pollard 2028 and 2029, that's what I'm looking at. Move people to Pollard, High Rock becomes available. Why does your capacity go down?
Because in this graphic, Stuart, the assumption is that you're no longer occupying Mitchell at all.
Ah, okay.
Right. So you're immediately vacating Mitchell to get those students in a much better facility than they're in currently.
Got it.
So that's why you have that narrow bandwidth right in between the 2 projects, because it assumes you're getting rid of Mitchell. If, for example, you were to occupy Mitchell and have High Rock as a 6th elementary school during that time frame, the entirety of that gap between the 2 projects would look like the graph on the right. Right, because you would have both.
But I presume if you didn't do anything with Mitchell, you wouldn't have as high a capacity, but you certainly would have more capacity.
You would actually have more capacity than what's on the right, because Mitchell is currently a 4-section school. So you would have a 4-section and a 3-section school both online at the same time. At the conclusion of this, you have 2 3-section schools. High Rock is a 3-section and Mitchell is a 3-section.
Got it.
Right. But what you would have is you'd have to invest in Mitchell for a much longer time frame to keep it operational if you were to execute that as a plan.
Sure.
And Michelle will talk about a little bit more about that in just a minute. Go ahead. Thank you, Michelle. And so here's what the capacity analysis looks like at High Rock. And so I think we've known this for a while, but even with the dip in enrollment between 2019 and 2020, the entirety of the forecast is outside the capacity of the High Rock facility, which is why they're occupying every single space, 100% of the time. And there are still programs and services that can't be delivered simply because of space limitations there.
Quick question.
Yes.
Even though our enrollments in the elementary schools are essentially level or going down, it looks like that's happening here too. It's still a little beyond the range.
Yes, it is. And we would expect, George, that if we were to pick up and lift off the forecast from the elementary schools and sort of tack it on the end, that we might see that same sinusoidal shape for the High Rock property.
Okay, I think that has implications. I know that we're somewhat overcrowded at High Rock, but that has some implications that you might not be as bad off in the future as you are now in terms of having not enough space there. In other words, it's not getting worse, it's getting better. No?
Well, I mean, if you look at where the enrollment was before, it was up near 500 before.
Right.
And the elementary forecast, as I said, is trending up, and then it trends back down again at the forecast. We would expect this to be, up and down over the next 30 years. What we don't expect it to do is drop back down to the 400 level, which is what would be necessary, 425, to bring it into capacity at High Rock.
That's the hard projection to make now, because that you're showing that capacity needs going up in about 27, 28. I'm not saying that this is incorrect. I'm simply saying it's out in the fairly distant future. Not that we don't have to start preparing for it, but it is dropping. And my question, this is one of the hard questions as a taxpayer that we need to ask is, so we had 500 students and we put them all through High Rock, many of whom said that was a great experience for us. They were educated, I guess you could say as well as could be expected, but certainly met the requirements. And if the enrollment's going down somewhat, why isn't that still acceptable, even though it's a little over what we would like it to be? That's a hard question to answer to taxpayers in the town.
I don't know what you're seeing that where the enrollment is going down. The current enrollment's 449, and the 2035-36 projection is 455.
Isn't that, I'm looking at that same graph that we see, and you see a little bit of a hump for the next few years, and then doesn't it drop down?
Right, but then it goes back up again by the end of the forecast.
Right, but what I'm saying is it doesn't start to go up until 27 to 28, 29, in that range. And then it starts to go up. Obviously, we're assuming that the McKibben projections are correct.
Yeah. That's all we can assume at the moment. I guess the way we're interpreting this is, unlike the elementary schools where some of the models suggest you might be tight for a few years, this analysis suggests that High Rock is going to be overcrowded for the foreseeable future.
I got you, but still less than the peak times of a few years ago.
Sure, that's fair, but that doesn't make it any less of a problem.
I understand. I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Sure.
For a reason, and that is that I've actually been asked that question by a few people. If we were so successful with High Rock and the students did well and they went into Pollard and onto the high school and did extremely well, and we were substantially higher than we're projecting, then why can't we deal with that over the next few years to see what the projection really is 7 or 8 years out? So it's a hard question to answer, I think.
Well, I think what we've heard from the building principals is that it's been an extraordinary lift on the educators' part to make that building work, particularly at the peak enrollments. And that there are experiences that the 6th graders aren't getting because there isn't room there that the 7th and 8th graders are getting because there is room at Pollard. Mm-hmm. And so this capacity argument, I think, is reinforcing that experience of particularly the High Rock principal.
Jason, Hank has his hand up.
I also think, Jason, from what I've heard, is that there's a real deficiency in the special education.
Right.
And you may, George, hear that the majority of the students going through have a good experience. but I think there's a minority who have a very bad experience and have a deficiency in terms of their education. And you really, at least that's what I've understood as the compromise of trying to stuff that many students into that school.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point, Hank. Thank you for that. So in this, we're associating this graphic with the existing status quo and what the fund transfer request identified as a new status quo. And when we resequence those projects, and Michelle will get to the timelines in just a minute, notice that the little house here for the High Rock project is off of the timeline. Our updated timeline suggests that this addition doesn't happen until the year 2040, because the Mitchell and Pollard projects would be higher priorities because of the facility condition. And so this capacity challenge could potentially exist for another generation. Okay, Michelle, you want to go on? So then if we look at Pollard, you can see again the capacity bandwidth and the enrollments there. And so the forecast jumps around a little bit here, but is entirely within the capacity, even excluding the modulars. I think the Tamitha might argue that they're at or over capacity with the modulars, but applying the same analytical technique to this that we applied to all the other buildings, it appears that you could fit within the existing building with their current daily schedule, with the spaces that are available even without the modulars. And so once an addition got placed on that to remedy things like the science classrooms, because they're permanent construction, they would add a little bit of additional capacity to that property. And that's what you're seeing in the little bump up at the end. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Michelle, and she's going to walk through our various design explorations.
So part of our analysis was to study some additional test fits on the different sites that we had looked at. And one of those was the High Rock site. We had originally, in our first go round with the master plan, proposed additions in the stormwater management culvert at the back of the building, as well as on the side of the building. And we were asked to go and see where else on the site we could add some an addition to the building. So we took some advantage of the parking area and upper bus loop, as well as the lower area here, to come up with some additional options for space to address the space needs of the High Rock School. So if this were to remain a grade 6 school, we would have an addition, a 2-story addition of classrooms here and here on the second floor. And these would be located in that upper parking lot and bus loop. And then we would have some renovations within the building. And we would put a 2-story addition on the lower portion at that, where that bus loop is, for administration and moving some other functions to that area, as well as expanding the gym and cafeteria on 2 levels. And by doing that, we would be able to address the needs of the school for grade 6. That would, so the capacity analysis that you saw where grade 6 was completely off the charts, these additions would bring them back into the charts, as well as provide additional gym and cafeteria space that would meet the MSBA guidelines. And in the pink area here, you also see some of the additional special education classrooms. If you have any questions, just stop me.
This would not encroach on the fields, right?
It would probably encroach on the driveway, which may
on the
all
left side.
But the driveway is not a big problem. You can still deal with that.
It may have an impact on the playground. So if you were here, you might have to push the driveway, and you might have impact on the playground. Essentially, the field is there in this option would not be impacted.
Yeah, I think that it's important to note that if you, in either case, you have to look at parking. And if you eliminate the bus loop on the upper level and eliminate the parking on the upper level, you'll have to replicate that on the lower level. And that will imply modification, I think, to some portion of the playground and or fields. That would be, so any addition there, unless there's acquisition of adjacent property, any addition there will impact the playing area at a minimum and perhaps a portion of the fields.
That's problematic.
Yeah, I think that the town needs to look at property acquisition in certain facilities on a long-term basis.
This is the Pollard Test Fit that we had shown you during the first master plan options, where we extended the parking area, extended the bus loop, provided a new addition to the building in the back of the building, and then created a loop road around the building. In this scenario, we've gone on to further test fit the actual new or updated program, which is slightly larger than what we had in the master plan. Jason, I don't know if you want to add any comments about what has been added to this program.
Yeah, basically in our middle school programming group, we worked through a theoretical daily schedule. We talked about what spaces were necessary for all 3 grades. And we went so far as to have the building principals do a conceptual design exercise where they thought the best location for all of those program elements might be. And ultimately what we came away with was we had speculated about an 80,000 square foot addition in the 2019 study. And based on this recent work with the principals, that needed to be 100,000 square foot addition. And so we added about 20,000 square feet of space that we didn't have in that previous study. But as a result of the test fit, what it demonstrated was 6th grade, for example, could go in the single story portion of the existing building. 7th grade sort of go between the existing building and the new addition. And then 8th grade similarly go in the new addition and on the lower level of the existing building per the principal's idealized layout. And so we felt like we demonstrated that we could execute the program they identified in a renovation addition scenario, with the caveat being that the addition needed to be slightly larger than it was 2 years ago.
So would this put all the science classrooms out in the new wing?
No. So what we would do, George, what we have requested is to locate science in such a way that you can have cohesive grade level teams. So science is scattered throughout both the existing building and the new addition, and the renovation portion would be done in such a way to right size science across the board. So you would have parity with science both in the existing building and in the new addition, but they would not be located all together. And that's pretty typical with a middle school model.
As part of our recent work, we were also asked to look at a option E, which was a revision to the status quo. And with that revision, you were able to build a 4-section school on the Mitchell site by adding additional classrooms to the Elliott School. And so the question here was, would additional classrooms fit on the Elliott School site? So using the same model of classroom groupings that are within the existing building, we used the back end of the building to add a 2-story addition to that using that same model with 6 classrooms, 3 on each floor, and some additional special education spaces and additional toilet rooms. It would sit back here in the back of the site. And we know that additional site work would have to happen on the site in order to make that work. the cost estimate for that additional site work has not been incorporated into any of our studies yet.
There's room there between the back of the building and the rock?
The rock is back here. And so the back of this right here is sort of sits in the footprint of the former school footprint and that old area.
Is there a loss of playground space?
Yeah.
Perhaps.
I'm sure there, right?
Yeah, because I think that's where they are
Definitely.
located now.
That's where the playground is now.
Yeah.
Right. So if you were to continue the loop road, you'd have to move the loop road into the playground space, or maybe the loop road doesn't go all the way around the building, but it would certainly have an impact on the site.
Yeah, I mean, the loop road, if you think about the loop road the same way it is at Sunita Williams, the emergency access to the back of Sunita Williams is all play space. So it's not used as a loop road, it's only used as an emergency access point. I think the greater difficulty here is adding any additional car parking to the site, which is already very constrained.
But isn't that orange rectangle, doesn't that superimpose now on existing playground facilities?
It's superimposed over the existing roadway. So the road goes like this. You can see it underneath there.
Right, but aren't there playground facilities
Yes,
as well?
the playground is back here.
Yes. The answer is yes. The students currently use that. It's not really a road. It's a broad pathway, and it is also used for playground space.
So moving on to the Mitchell. So this study here is from this image here is from our previous study. This is a 5-section school on the Mitchell site. What we're showing you here is a 2-story building, and you can see that it takes up most of the area of the field. If you were to think about this being the entrance in front of the school and the loop road that comes out here, and then the entrance into the existing parking area, this is about where the modular classrooms would be. And then the playground sits about here. And then a 3-section school. And this is actually a copy of the Elliott's, the existing Elliott School, which is a 3-section school, and placed on this site just so that you have a comparison of what that would look like. So it's 2 stories on the existing Mitchell site.
We thought about 3 stories on that site.
We've thought about it. We think that massing wise, it would be large for that site, given proximity of the homes and the topography of that site. But it's certainly something to consider.
Again, just to give contextual reference here, this Mitchell School on the right is the existing roundabout in the back, correct?
Yeah,
that's Tower Road. That's going right out
Tower.
there.
There's the wing of the school is about here, and it goes in this direction here.
Right. So essentially, you would lose the basketball court and half the fields. And some of it's off a little bit. Okay. And the modulars, current modulars, are right there in that open space on this right there, right? Yeah.
They're here, and then the newer model, the newer modulars are over here in the front of the school.
Correct. Yeah.
So moving on to the timelines, which you've all been asking for. So we started with some assumptions because it's hard to tell, exactly how long everything is going to take. We started with the assumption that you would submit your SOI and you would be invited in as quickly as you were invited for Sunita Williams. Regardless of whether it was the Mitchell School or the Pollard School that we were going for, we made the same assumption that you would submit and be invited in during the first go round. And that it would take you approximately 2 years to put together your team, all your contracts, and then start design. So that's what you see here, the first 2 years, submission of the SOI and design contracts to start. And then it would take you approximately a year to go through feasibility and schematic design. And don't forget, this is through the MSBA process. So everything is very scripted. Then you would have to go and fund the project. And again, this is another unknown. So that the 1 year here is pretty well known. The 2 years here is a little bit of an unknown. And the funding of the project is also a little unknown. When we did Sonita, it took us about 6 months to do that, to get the project funded. And depending on when you complete your design, when you ask the town to vote, whether you're holding special voting town meetings, or if you're funding it in a different way, that timeline could get longer. 6 months is a pretty short time for that. And then you would go into detailed design for about a year, submit your construction documents and permitting, and then you would start construction. And pretty much most of these schools would take about 2 years to go through your construction. Very similar to the Sonita project. So with that assumption, we moved into our master planning. Through this program process, we were asked to revise our initial A option, which was a status quo option. That showed Mitchell as a 5-section school and Pollard as just a 7 and 8 grade school, and High Rock as remaining as a grade 6 school. So status quo for grade configuration. And then a new status quo grade configuration was developed, asking us to look at Mitchell as a 4-section school. The Pollard stayed 7 and 8. The High Rock stayed grade 6. And this is where the addition on Elliott came into play to make up the difference between the Mitchell school being a 5-section school and only building a 4-section school. You'd put those extra classrooms over at Elliott. We were also asked to revise our option C, which was High Rock becoming a 3-section school and Mitchell being a 3-section school, and using Pollard as your first MSBA project. High Rock would not be an MSBA project, and Mitchell would then be an MSBA project as well. And then finally, the D1 option, which going into our last master plan was the preferred option. And that was Pollard not being an MSBA project and Mitchell being an MSBA project, but those two happening almost simultaneously. So you would start Pollard while you were doing the SOI process for Mitchell, and they would run about at the same time. And then High Rock would be a non-MSBA project. So if you were to look at that in a different way, these are the options. If the status quo for A would take 3 major building projects, the options C and D, where High Rock becomes your elementary school, that would be 2 major building projects because High Rock would just be repurposed without a major building project. And your option E status quo would be 4 major building projects. So 1 at Elliott, the 1 on the Mitchell site, the addition to High Rock that we just talked about, and then the renovations in addition to the Pollard School.
Michelle, could you go back to the previous slide for a second? Because I thought I saw where it says Pollard 6 through 8, and then High Rock as a 6th grade.
Yeah, you're right. That should have said elementary school. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. So then moving forward, our status quo. So this originally had Mitchell as the first project, and then you would do Pollard afterwards. If you look at this, there's the Mitchell school. In order to do any construction on the Mitchell site, you would have to build a temporary modular project. Designing and getting approval for this would come after you've already finished your schematic design and you completed your funding for the project. So the approval of the construction for the Mitchell School would be in line with the approval to go forward with the temporary building design and construction. So this timeline gets extended a little bit longer than that 6.5 years that we had spoke about. While you're waiting for all of this to happen and before the kids can move into this temporary building, you're also keeping that Mitchell building up and running at approximately $2.3 million for capital improvements. So that would be for your heating and power and any upgrades that you would need to keep that building online for that amount of time. When this building was occupied in January of 2029, you would then submit that following spring for the Pollard School SOI. And then you would start that process with the MSBA all over again. And this would be for an addition and renovation to the Pollard School for grades 7 and 8. While you're in the middle of the construction process for this, you could submit an SOI for the High Rock project. And if you don't get into the SOI, because now you've had 3 projects, into the MSBA funding, you've had 3 projects in a row, you could make a decision to fund the High Rock School addition by yourselves and then move forward. And again, this would carry you all the way out to 2040 for this master plan to be completed. There are some caveats in here, like the cost of the site is not, or site work at the High Rock School is not included in this $51.8 million. We haven't been able to do the additional cost estimating for that yet. So in conclusion, it's about $363.4 million for the master plan, plus some of that site, plus some capital improvements because you have to keep Pollard going while you're building the Mitchell School, and you have to keep the Mitchell School going until you can move the kids out. So that's roughly about $19.6 million to do all of that work. Now I just throw a lot at you, so just stop me if you.
I've been raising my hand and I didn't realize my video was completely off. I apologize.
If you're going to ask me to go back 5 slides, Barry, I'm not doing that.
So could you go back to the first slide we started? No, yeah. I got a question, Michelle. I know we've got the we were presented with some of the work that you did previous to this to go over some of the upkeep that's required. Is that where you're getting the $2.3 million for the Mitchell? No, there's quite a bit more work than that was in our capital improvement plans. But because you can't exceed $1.8 million over a 3-year period for this work, or else you will trigger some other code upgrades. I get it.
You have to keep that to a smaller amount.
But what is that year? What is that $2.3 million in terms of how long that was drawn
5 years.
out for? Oh,
5 years.
5 years. Okay. Yeah. And the Pollard, is that 17 million?
17.3, yep. And that is, so you had, you can't exceed the 5.7 over 3 years, but you have 12 years here that this is going on.
So the estimate is 17.3 million in 12 years to keep the Pollard up and running.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
Now you could not invest all of that, but that was, our capital improvement showed that you had immediate needs in the 1 to 3 years. Then you had, we did a 6 to 9 years, and then we went on. So
this was the GGD. Was this the GGD or the Weston and Sampson study?
No, this was our last master plan.
This was your, okay.
All right, so that timeline has some things to consider. That it means timely permitting of the DeFazio site, which we know has a lot of stormwater upgrades that need to happen. The winter conditions for foundations so that you can move the students in as quickly as possible and off the Mitchell site. And it assumes that you're doing that move in December so that you can hit the ground running first year on the Mitchell site.
If not, that timeline gets extended, 6 more months. Under the Pollard renovations, it was occupied phased constructions of the 7th and 8th grade students. So you're moving those students around the building as you're renovating one part, moving students in, and so that construction gets extended about 6 months. And then the High Rock, it was that you could either go through the MSBA or go it alone if you don't have success with the MSBA right away. And that timeline did not include the purchasing of additional property, as Hank had mentioned, if you needed additional property or any extensive permitting that might have to happen. The option E, which was the new option, is very similar to the one I just went through in all ways, with the exception that at the end of this, because you're only building a 4-section school here, so it's smaller and it costs less. At the end of that, you're going to come in and do an addition onto Elliott. And we put this at the very end because if you remember the enrollment charts that Jason had showed you, you may get out to that point and decide that you don't need those additional classrooms on that site because the enrollment across the district has gone down. So it's better to build it at the end than to build it at the beginning and have too many classrooms in your elementary portfolio. But because it's way out there at the end, the cost for 10,000 square feet, goes up incrementally with the escalation. And again, neither of these include the cost of the site work that would have to be done on that site. And so essentially the considerations are the same as those that we just went through. So if we move into the C options, we have 2 C options here. And the first one here says that now the Pollard School is going to be your first priority school because you're going to solve the Mitchell problem by moving Mitchell kids into the High Rock School. So in order to do that, you have to move the kids out of the High Rock School. That means you have to have an addition onto the Pollard School to do that. So Pollard becomes your first priority project. You're into the MSBA early next spring, and you've moved the kids out of the High Rock and into the Pollard School in January of 2028. And then you can begin, the Mitchell kids move in here, and now you can go and submit your SOI for the Mitchell School and go forward with that. Again, capital improvements for Pollard to keep it going until you're at the point where you can start construction. As you can see, much less money. For Mitchell, it remains the same because those kids get out of that school and into this school at an earlier time. So you do not have to keep that school online for the additional few years. And as I said, I did 2 of these. I'm going to skip the considerations there for a second, because as we began to talk about it, we realized that moving 2 schools, the High Rock kids into the Pollard School and the Mitchell kids into the High Rock School over that 2-week Christmas break is probably more than any district wants to take on. So to extend that to the end of the year made a lot more sense. It does cost a little bit more money, but it makes more sense.
Just 1 second. George, you have your hand up. Are you?
Yeah, it's kind of an overview question as it relates to MSBA. It's unusual for MSBA to fund multiple projects, even sequential multiple projects. Is it really very likely that we could get funding for 2 projects? I don't think so. That's just my gut feel. Have you done that before?
You want to, Jason, you want to handle that, or Dawn?
Well, I want somebody to answer that one.
Yeah.
So
whoever has the courage to do it.
If you're successful getting the MSBA to participate in the Pollard project, and your expectation is to immediately get accepted back into the program after its conclusion, I think it's fair to say that it's less likely, but not impossible.
and knowing, don't we have some feedback already that they don't have much feeling for making Pollard the first project?
I think the new information, George, is that the enrollment trajectory has changed and that you have a plan for the Mitchell capacity and facility issues that would be resolved with a Pollard project.
So in other words, we'd have to go into MSBA and get them to understand that it makes sense to us for the first project to be the Pollard project and the second project be the Mitchell project.
Correct.
So that would be a real selling job to them, and for them to participate.
Yes, I think that's probably true. But it all depends on the enrollment forecast, right? If let's say the elementary enrollment in that 6-year window where you're completing the Pollard project goes way up, then you have an argument to be made that, right, we got the kids out of the facility that was in poor condition, but now we have a capacity issue and we need to add that Mitchell project back to our inventory to resolve that capacity issue.
Okay, that's going to be a hard one, yeah, I think.
It is fair to say projects done sequentially in one town so close together, I think are highly unusual. A lot of it will depend on what's happening with all the other communities in the Commonwealth and who's submitting at the same time.
Correct, and I don't think we stand, I mean, they love the projects we do, that's for sure, but we're also considered one of those wealthy communities that probably doesn't need help as much as other communities do. That's my gut feel about it. And they know we do a great job. They in fact, even tell other people we do a great job. However, I don't think that's a given that it would be easy to get that second project.
Correct.
Okay.
I think one thing to show is that by September 2028, you have served a larger number of students than you would in September of 2028 if you only were doing the Mitchell School. And I think that would be very important for them to hear. By going with the Pollard School first, you've addressed everything from kindergarten to grade 8 for a very large group of kids in a very short amount of time. If you had to just do the Mitchell School first, that timeline's the same, but you've only addressed the Mitchell students. So here you've affected a lot more kids. And I think that would be a message that would be important to them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is that it really is going to require more of a selling job than we have done before when we took individual schools one at a time. It wasn't hard to sell them on Sunita Williams, for sure. But getting them to move off the mark that Mitchell is a high priority and move them to Pollard's now a high priority and Mitchell's next is going to require a lot of work on our part to convince them of that, I think. Not that it can't be done, but that's not going to be easy to do.
There's no baggage with Pollard?
By that, what do you mean?
With the MSBA, there's no baggage with Pollard. I mean, when I moved here 30 years ago, Pollard was going through this and Mitchell was the next one in line. And 30 years later, Mitchell's still not done and we're going back to Pollard.
I don't know about that. I think it's just that MSBA believes that the most needy of the schools in the district is the Mitchell School. And they're looking at it not from an overview 6th, 7th, and 8th.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
So I'm not sure. I'm not I'm not sure what their reasoning is, but I think it is going to take that real discussion and education on their part to get them to believe that, number one, you could do Pollard first and then Mitchell second, or they might just say, okay, it's your choice, do whatever you want first, and then you're on the hook for the rest of it.
Yeah,
so probably right.
Just hold on a second, folks. I just want to make sure from time check, we're way over on this particular agenda item. It's important. I just want to make sure that we stick to the topic and understand where we need to go.
Right. I'm going to move on to D, but I also want to point out, if you had to go with a school on your own, then the Mitchell school is far less costly than the Pollard school. So that might be a reason to go in this direction as well.
Yeah, agree.
In the final option that we looked at, again, we'll skip this, was the D option, the D1 option. And what this does is you are now taking Pollard on your own. And so you would be doing this work on your own, which would accelerate the Pollard project. You save some time because you're not the whole 2 years in that beginning where you're waiting for the SOI and developing the team for the MSBA. You would save that amount of time, move the students out of the Mitchell school, and then begin with the Mitchell school as your SOI. And this, if you were successful in starting this on your own, you can even submit your SOI a year prior to the students moving out, so that as soon as the Mitchell kids are off the site, you could be ready and to go. And you haven't expended any money during that SOI process, because that is the time where you're waiting for the MSBA to approve your project and you're putting together your team. Oops, sorry. So just recapping all of that fairly quickly. So option A was about 18 years. The option C took about 13 years. The option D1 was about 11 years to completion. And option E1 took you about 21 years to completion. And you can see the costs of those noted just above. And so finally, how are you going to make your choices? So it really comes down to, where do you believe grade 6 should go? Because if you believe that grade 6 should stay on its own and be an independent school, then your options should follow along here. Mitchell becomes your priority project. And then the question is, how many sections per grade can you put on the Mitchell site? I showed a dash line here at 5-section school, because we honestly feel that that's too big for that site. So you'd probably go with the 4-section school, build your modulars, do your renovations and additions to Pollard, put your addition on High Rock, and then come back in with an addition on Elliott. And that would resulting in about $360 million. If you decide that grade 6 does belong on the Pollard site, then the Pollard is your priority project. Mitchell becomes a 3-section school. And then the question is, do you go with the Pollard as an MSBA project, or do you try to do it on your own? And that sequence would result in about 299 to 309 million, depending on which option you would choose. Thank you. I know we went way over our time, but thank you so much.
I think it was very valuable. I think the question I would have, George, you still have your hand up. Do you have a question, or
no?
Can I?
No.
Okay, thanks. So I think for the purpose of this meeting, we wanted to get an update of where things were, I believe. And Hank, at this stage, there's nothing to act on except an invoice for this committee. Is there anything else that's being asked of that needs to be contended with during this segment?
Well, in fact, they haven't submitted their invoice yet. So that's a separate appropriation for the Ridge Hill property that we want next on the agenda.
No. Hank, my question is on the school master plan. Is there anything else we need to discuss relative to the master plan?
No, I'd say the only thing is timing. The anticipation is that they'll be wrapping up with a draft report prior to the end of the year or early in the new year. And so we would want to come back prior to the end of the year to give a yet another update before this committee accepts the final report. There is also a fair amount of work working with Dave Davison to figure out whether of the different scenarios, which one fits within the financial model for the town.
Okay.
I have my hand up again. Can I ask one last question?
Go ahead, George.
And this relates to where do we go next? I guess, it's great to do the report. This data looks good and interesting, but where does it go from here? What decisions get made by whom, in what time frame? Does this go to the select board? Does it go to the finance committee? Does it go to the school board? I mean, what happens to it after I think there needs to be some, we had some discussion here tonight, but I really believe there needs to be some discussion amongst all the parties that are interested. I don't know how that would take place or when, but what do you think, Hank?
But I was
I'll let Anne, perhaps. Yeah. Do you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah. Sure. Definitely it has to go back to the facilities working group. This is the group that includes obviously the finance committee and others. And this is after Dave provides information from a financing standpoint. The December timeline for him to provide information is a pretty aggressive one because we're smack in the middle of budget right now. So his capacity and bandwidth may be somewhat limited. After that, I think we need to decide after the groups discuss and come to consensus on which direction, maybe using some of the decision-making questions that Dorn Whittier had laid out. Some of the scenarios actually have a statement of interest being submitted in the spring. So there is, in some scenarios, next steps that would begin relatively quickly, but that timing would sort of depend on the scenario that's selected.
And did you have your hand up for responding, or do you have a question?
No, it was a question for Hank. I don't know the extent to which you've actually talked to Dave about whether he has the capacity to meet a end of December sort of timeline for finishing up the financials.
I have not had that discussion. I guess it was noted that he has the spreadsheets prepared. And so where he had to compose all the spreadsheets previously, now in theory, he can plug in some new numbers and turn around a response relatively quickly. But no, we are waiting for, I guess it would be the town manager to schedule that next facilities working group.
Thank you.
Okay.
I just can't imagine us coming to conclusions without a broader overall discussion. Even it certainly could start with a facilities working group, but then what happens next? I think there needs to be an overall discussion, and I think that's critically important that everybody hear the same presentation and then be able to come to some conclusion as to what the right direction should be. This is a huge decision for this town. And I think it's gonna take some time for people to digest it.
I think you're correct, George, but I also think, just in the interest of this committee, our responsibility is to do the report. And I think the facilities working group is really the body that needs to figure that out, correct?
I agree. And I certainly will strongly encourage that in the group.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, and I think Dan, who's not here this evening, has indicated that there would need to be public meetings with the school committee to talk about the plan, and in essence to bring in that public comment. Even choosing the least expensive option may have huge hurdles from a logistical point of view. Right. So those factors need to be weighed one against the other.
Yeah. So we'll so I just think in the interest of time, I think we're ready to wrap up this side of the agenda, unless Hank, there's anything specific, or Anne, I would ask anything from your side that you feel needs to be covered. I see heads shaking. Okay, fine. So I'd like to bring a close to the school master plan update. So I appreciate Doran Whittier and the team for presenting. And we will now, there is no, I was incorrect at the beginning of this. There is no voting item for this particular topic. We do have a voting topic in the next one. And then we have one outside of that. Jack Cogswell will do in the other side of the business. So with that, I'd like to turn over to the Ridge Hill demolition. And are you covering that as well, Hank?
Yes, and a familiar cast of characters. Don Walter is here, and he'll speak to that project as well. And Michelle and I guess Jason is less involved, but Don certainly is involved. As you may recall, we did go through a value engineering exercise following the original report that Doran Whittier put together. That value engineering exercise was in coordination with the Finance Committee and others. And the amount that came out of that value engineering exercise was then put into and approved by town meeting at the last special town meeting. The proposal that Doran Whittier have put together for their services is slightly less than what was in that original exercise. And I think across the board, what we have heard is that the goal is to bring the project in under budget where possible. But there are a series of steps that the design team needs to go through. The anticipated schedule for the project was spelled out in their proposal that I shared with everybody. It's about a 9-month process, taking us through design, demolition happening late spring, early summer. So the closeout of the project and reseeding of grass areas and things like that could occur prior to or during September of next year. So Don, are there any other details you want to take us through on that proposal?
No, I think you covered it well, Hank. You know, we do know that we're going to be working with Conservation, Historic Commission, Building Department, fire departments, and whatnot. So there is time built in for that. We don't know how long that process may take, but we've allocated 3 months worth of time to go through those processes. May take less time. Seems like it certainly could. But you know how these things work out. Sometimes it could take more time. But I think it is fair to say that we should be able to get through this process, have the property demolished and ceased in the fall.
We do have, as noted in the second sheet that was distributed, we do have contingencies built into the estimate. They're not as robust as they were originally, but and there's anticipated escalation that was built into that design as well. There has been some testing going on, excavation and testing on the site. There may need to be some more in advance of the release of the documents. And as they go through the design, we will certainly have to get an updated cost estimate, and we'll do a cross-check on that cost estimate as well.
Yeah.
So, Stuart, the approval that we're asking for this evening is for the Doran Whittier fee of $55,000.
Okay.
To proceed with this project.
Okay. So I will put forth a proposal to support the Doran Whittier additional services of $55,000, which would come out of the architecture budget for the Ridge Hill demolition. I hear a second?
Second.
Thank you, Richard. Any questions? Hearing none, coming to the vote. Richard?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
Lynn?
Aye.
Erwin?
Aye.
Chair is aye. Okay. Anything else, Hank?
I believe that the two user group representatives will be appointed tomorrow by the select board, and that will include Barry DuLong and Kate Fitzpatrick, but they have not been officially appointed as of yet.
Okay, George, you had something?
I did have one question, and that is, have the discussions, I guess this is for Hank, have the discussions started with the Historical Commission to see, and this is an important point, I think, to see whether or not we're going to have to do a delay in the process, or whether we will be able to avoid that delay, which should save us some money, certainly, in escalation. Have we had that discussion? And if not, when should we start that discussion? I would assume as soon as possible.
No, I think there were informal discussions, and certainly the Historic Commission has been aware of all the other variations and attempts to reuse the building without any success. So I think having gone through all of those multiple steps during the past decade, it's pretty clear that there is no alternate use for the building. But we would certainly have that discussion with them very soon.
Okay, I think, who's the current chair? Is it Rose Doherty?
I am not sure.
One of the suggestions I might make is, if it is Rose Doherty, I know her pretty well, and it might be a good idea to start those discussions as informal discussions as soon as possible. And maybe all we'll have to do is submit a request to the Historical Commission to waive that period. And that could happen fairly quickly. But I don't know what they would need to make that happen, but it certainly would be a great idea to, if they would waive that, make it a lot easier and less expensive for us.
Yeah, I'm still reading through all the background.
Okay, well, it doesn't have to be decided right now. My point is that I'd be happy to participate in that discussion if you want.
Great, that'd be very helpful, George. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Right, great. Anything else regarding Ridge Hill? Okay, I will close down the Ridge Hill segment. We'll now go to the PVC other business.
Did we vote on
that? I thought we did.
Yes.
Good.
Yes. Because I did ask you, Erwin, because you were here versus the other one. How's that? That's what made me realize that we did vote it.
Okay. We voted the approval of the invoice?
Yes.
It's the services agreement. Yes.
The services estimate.
Okay.
Correct.
So we are closed down on the Ridge Hill demolition project topic for tonight. We're now to PVC other business.
Thank you, everyone.
Hey, Don, thanks. We have two.
Great Thanksgiving, all of you.
Yeah.
Thank you, you too.
There's just two topics that I have. Hopefully they're relatively quick. We have one invoice regarding Jack Cogswell's solar. So I would like to put forth the invoice from Beacon Integrated Solutions for October 2021 services for $984.39 coming out of the miscellaneous budget. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Thank you, George. Any questions? Hearing none.
I have a question about the process, but after the vote for that.
Okay. Coming to the vote, Richard?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
Lynn?
Aye.
Erwin?
Aye.
Great. And the chair is aye as well. Okay, so that's the last voting item. Is there any other voting items, Catherine, that need to be covered?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. All right, great. George, you wanted to follow up on your topic?
Just a quick question about the process. So how do we start the process with a vendor, I guess you'd call him a vendor, of the solar project? And are we going to do that, or is someone else in the town going to do that?
The PPPA? Yeah, go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, the first step is that we need to get approval from the DPU or the single parcel rule. And that, as you may recall, is because we already have a solar facility at the RTS. And so we need their approval to put a second one. The PPA will most likely, well, I'll step back and say, there is a pre-negotiated installer that we can utilize that goes through Power Options. Barry's familiar with Power Options because we utilize Power Options contracts for the installation of and replacement of LED lighting throughout many of the buildings within town. And they have a series of pre-negotiated contracts with various delivery companies for this type of facility. We had initiated those discussions with, what's her name, Something Solutions, way back when we first started the process of thinking about solar on the Jack Cogswell building. And they have come back and through verbal discussions with Beth Greenblatt, they've indicated that they'd be prepared to accept basically the financial deal that she had spelled out in her last estimate. And so if that's the case, and the deal is yes, it needs to be finally negotiated, but we don't have to go out to competitive bid. We could go directly to this one provider. And at least in her opinion, that's probably equal to or better than any other deal that we would get in the open marketplace today.
So what I don't understand is, how can you negotiate a deal with one vendor when you can't do that with any other public bidding process? It has to be a competitive bidding process. Why wouldn't you have 2 or 3 companies provide us their deal and see which is the best deal? I don't know. I'm just curious. I'm ignorant in this regard when it comes to solar stuff. But aren't there any rules that require you to do something like that?
If we stepped out of the bounds of the pre-negotiated, so for Power Options to go into the deal that they already have with the state, they went through a bidding process, a competitive bidding process with various providers. And they, as long as they stay within the rates that they've already competitively bid, then we do not need to go to other bidders. we use the same system for getting the EV chargers. There were pre-negotiated bid prices. And we actually found, George, that when we were talking to others who had, I think they were federal opportunities to bid on different jobs, at least on the EV, we were getting about a 20% better deal than we would otherwise if we went out for three prices. So
are there any other elements such as maintenance in the future? Some companies are better than the others. I'm just curious.
Yeah, if I may, I would just like, I think what we do need though is I think we need a summary, and I think we should go have a review in the next committee meeting is where do we stand on solar and what's the actions going forward? And I think these questions are really relevant, but it might make sense for you, Hank, to do some research and provide that. So I think the committee, now that it's been voted to go forward, we should get an update of where we are and how it's going to be addressed.
And what role we should play in that, if any.
I think largely it would be out of our hands because we do not have to, George, if we wanted to go back and competitively bid this, we would have to rehire, we'd have to go out to an RFQ to rehire a designer because the Weston and Sampson contract has now concluded and expired. And we would have to then hire that designer, which might very well be Weston and Sampson. We'd have to put the documents out on the street. We'd have to do the competitive bid.
I'm not suggesting that we do that, Hank. I just want to make sure we don't break any rules.
No, I hear you. I hear you. And
but I do think the committee should evaluate in the next meeting to this topic what our role is. But I think, George, our role is that we've made the recommendation. I think we just have to govern the process and make sure it's done right. I think because it's still within the context of the project, I think, but we should get that answer.
Right.
I think our role will be the continuing effort by our consultant, Beth Greenblatt, and Beacon Integrated Solutions to advise us on that contract, the final contract.
Yeah, I think, Hank, I would look at, and I don't have it in front of me, but if the article in the warrant, I think, says for funds to be distributed by the town manager, I think, but that should tell us a little bit. Maybe we need to go back to Kate to verify.
Yeah,
I mean, in essence,
right.
In essence, I think it becomes a DPW project and maybe a maintenance project that Barry takes on.
Can you get that answered for us, Hank? And I'll be happy to talk to Kate if need be.
Okay, I'll put that together.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. The only other topic I had was just to every year we talk about the board positions and the roles and voting that in. I think our next meeting is December 13th. We should review the board positions and vote them in, chair and vice chair. And I don't know if anybody wants to have any discussion at this point in time, but I wanted to put it on the table that we should, as we agreed the other year, we should have a vote before the end of the calendar year for the following year, as we did last year as well. So if we could just add that, Catherine, to the PVC other business in the next meeting. Okay. Those are the two topics that I had. Is there any other topics from anybody else that we need to cover?
Just wanted to take a minute to thank both Hank and Catherine for a really good job of making Steve's retirement party so successful.
That was great. And Erwin, your note was read. It was
good.
Catherine got that.
Thank you, Catherine.
You're welcome.
It was definitely a good event. I think it was really exciting to see Steve and all the different comments that were there, and his kids that were there, and grandkids. So well done, you guys.
About how many people were there?
50?
50 or maybe 50.
More than
50
50
to 60. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of his family came, and I will share the slideshow we put together.
Yeah, that's great.
It was all very good.
Great. Okay, with that, I will close out the meeting tonight, and everybody have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Be safe.
Thank you. Go Patriots.
Thanks, everybody.
Go Patriots. Go Pats.
All right. Good night.